The wrong sea sky outside the airport lounge was turning orange. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the floor of the terminal. Sundar Pichai, dressed simply in a gray hoodie and worn sneakers, sat quietly by the window. He looked more like a quiet professor than the CEO of one of the most powerful companies in the world. He sipped his tea slowly, trying to stay grounded. He had flown thousands of times, but this trip was different. This time he was flying not for business, but for something more personal, something that had kept him awake for nights. His mother was sick, and he hadn't told anyone at work. He wanted to be there as a son, not as a CEO, not as the man people tried to impress. The announcement came over the speaker. First class boarding. Sundar stood up and walked to the gate. He didn't expect anyone to recognize him. He preferred. It batwayed Dot as he handed his boarding pass to the flight attendant. She looked him over with a sharp glance. Her smile faded. Sir, she said, frowning. This line is for first class. Sundar nodded politely. Yes, this is my seat. She looked again at his hoodie and old backpack. Then she glanced at his pass. Her expression changed, but only slightly. The kind of change that says she's not convinced, just out of reasons to argue. Right, she said. Go ahead. He walked into the jet bridge without a word. It wasn't the first time someone had made assumptions. But today, it hurt a little more. He found his seat in 1A and settled in. Just as he pulled out a small paperback from his bag, the same flight attendant walked over. Her expression was tight, her lips pressed together like she was holding back. Something, sir, she said again, this time louder. I think there's been a mistake. Sundar looked up, confused. A mistake? Yes, she said. This seat is for first-class passengers. He held out his boarding pass. I know. She said, but, are you sure this is your seat? He looked at her for a long second, not angry, just tired. I'm sure. She didn't respond. Instead, she turned to another passenger, a man in a designer suit standing in the aisle. Please give us a moment. She told the man, who raised an eyebrow. We're trying to sort this out. Sundar felt his cheeks grow warm. People were starting to look. A whisper traveled from seat to seat. Who is this man in economy clothes sitting in a first-class seat? Was he lost? Was he trying to sneak? And he closed his eyes for a moment. Breathed in, breathed out. If there's a problem, he said softly, you can check the manifest. But the attendant didn't move. She seemed frozen, caught between doubt and disbelief. A few more moments passed before another flight attendant, older and calmer, approached. She leaned in, whispered something in the younger woman's ear. Then she looked at Sundar, and her eyes widened. Oh my God, she whispered. Then louder, Mr. Pichai, I'm so sorry. Please forgive us. Please, just make yourself comfortable. But it was too late. The moment had passed. The damage was done. Sundar nodded politely. But the air around him had shifted. The whispering stopped, replaced by silence. A heavy silence as the plane took off. He stared out the window, the city lights flickering below. He had faced boardrooms, filled with billionaires, spoken to presidents and prime ministers. But nothing stung quite like being mistaken for someone who didn't belong, and yet there was something else. Something deeper, a memory. A long-forgotten feeling. He remembered a time when he really didn't belong. When shoes were a luxury, and hunger was a companion. When he had to walk miles just to find a classroom. He looked at his hands. The same hands that had once held rusted textbooks were now typing emails that shaped the future. And yet, in the eyes of that flight attendant, he was invisible again. Or worse, less than but this time, he wasn't going to forget. Because the moment the plane touched down, something would change. Something inside him had already started to move. A quiet storm. And it was only just beginning. Asterisk. The stranger in seat 1B, the engines hummed beneath the aircraft like a steady heartbeat. Above the clouds, the world seemed peaceful, disconnected from the noise below. But inside Sundar Pichai's mind, the silence was anything but calm. He sat still, almost motionless, his eyes fixed on the black expanse outside the window. His reflection stared back at him, fragile and tired. The air felt different up here. Thinner, maybe. Or maybe it was just the weight of the moment pressing down on his chest. He had not expected to feel so raw, so a human dot. The sting of what had just happened hadn't faded. That flight. Attendant's doubt, her disbelief, had left a mark. Not because of her words, but because of what they meant. To her, he didn't fit the shape of power. He wasn't dressed in a sharp suit or wearing a gold watch. He didn't announce himself with wealth. He arrived quiet. And to some people, quiet meant less Dot as he tried to steady his thoughts. He felt movement beside him. Someone had just sat. Down in seat 1B, Sundar turned his head slightly and saw a man in his late 50s, dressed in a navy blue blazer and slacks. There was nothing loud about him either, but his confidence filled the space. The man placed a leather briefcase at his feet, adjusted his glasses, and leaned back in his seat. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. It was the kind of silence that wasn't awkward, just unspoken. Two strangers trying to exist without disturbing the other. But then the man turned slightly, studying Sundar with a look that suggested recognition. Not quite sure. Not quite uncertain. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice low and steady. "Are you Sundar Pichai?" Sundar blinked. He wasn't in the mood for conversation, but he couldn't bring himself to be rude. He gave a small nod. "Yes," he said softly. The man smiled, more to himself than anyone else. "I thought, so you gave a talk at MIT a few years ago. My daughter was there. She called me afterward, crying, said it changed her life." Sundar looked at the man for the first time. Really looked. He had kind eyes, but behind them was a heaviness. The kind of weight people carried when they had seen too much of the world. "I remember that talk," Sundar replied. "She must have been very thoughtful to share something so personal with you afterward." The man nodded, his smile fading just slightly. "She was. She still is. But it's been a hard few years. That's why I'm on this flight, actually. Going to see her. She hasn't spoken to me in months. I'm hoping this visit changes something." Sundar nodded slowly, understanding more than he let on. Family can be complicated. He said that there was a pause between them, just long enough for the man to shift in his seat again and say something Sundar didn't expect. "I saw what happened earlier. With the flight attendant, I know what that feels like." Sundar looked away. He didn't respond right away. Wasn't going to say anything. The man continued. "But the way she looked at you, the way she questioned your right to be here. I've seen that look too. Too many times." Sundar exhaled. "It was quiet, but deep. It doesn't hurt less. Even when you've come a long way." Sundar said. Double quotes, "No." The man agreed. "It doesn't. But how you respond to it, that's what matters." They fell silent again. This time the silence was heavier. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was filled with unsaid truths. The man looked at Sundar and said, "May I ask you something personal?" Sundar hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Why do you fly alone?" The question caught him off guard. No one had ever asked him that before. "Because," Sundar said, choosing his words carefully, "I don't want the noise around me. Sometimes. I just want to be a son or a father or just a person. Not a CEO, not a symbol." The man seemed to understand. He didn't press further, but Sundar could feel a shift in the air. Something was building, and then, just as he reached for his book again, the man leaned closer and said something that made Sundar freeze. "I wasn't just talking about recognition earlier. I also know who you are because I worked for you once, indirectly. I was on a project you shut down 10 years ago, and I lost everything." Sundar's heart skipped. The moment hung in the air like a suspended breath. "I lost my job, my house, almost my marriage," the man continued. "And I told myself for years that it was your fault, that you were just another tech giant making decisions without thinking of the people underneath." Sundar turned to face him fully now. This wasn't a casual chat anymore. It was something else, something deeper. "I'm sorry," Sundar said. Quietly, "I never meant for anyone to be hurt." "I know," the man replied. "But sometimes sorry isn't enough. That's the thing about leadership. The people who work under you don't get to see your good intentions. They only feel the consequences. Sundar was quiet. He had nothing to say, or maybe too much to say, but the man added, his voice softening, I also saw what you did after that. The programs you built, the education funding, the climate work. My daughter was part of one of those scholarships. She wouldn't be where she is without it. So maybe it balances out. Asterisk, the tension in Sundar's chest didn't fully release, but something inside him shifted. Thank you, he said. I still think about the decisions I've made, the ones that hurt people. I just hope I've done more good than harm. The man smiled faintly. We all hope that, he said. The cabin lights dimmed. Most of the passengers were settling in for the night. The man beside him leaned back, closing his eyes. But Sundar didn't move. He just sat there staring into the dark, his mind racing with memories and regrets. He thought about his mother, waiting for him in a hospital room. He thought about the people he'd helped, and the ones he hadn't. And then, almost like a whisper in the back of his mind, a thought surfaced. What if this trip was not just about going home? What if something much bigger was waiting for him at the other end of this flight? Something he couldn't yet see, but could feel drawing closer. He didn't know it yet, but before this journey ended, he would be forced to confront the one decision he had buried deep in his past. A choice that could change everything. Asterisk, the woman at gate 19, the wheels of the aircraft. Touched down with a low, rumbling thud. There was a brief bounce, a deep vibration through the floor of the cabin, and then the slowing drag as the brakes engaged. Sundar Pichai looked out the window, watching the runway lights streak past like blurred stars. They had landed. The night outside was still, but inside him something was stirring. A quiet storm of memory, guilt, and unanswered questions. He remained seated while others stood to grab their bags. The man from seat 1B had already wished him luck, offered a handshake, and disappeared into the aisle with a brief nod. The conversation they had shared lingered in Sundar's mind like a smoke that wouldn't clear. It had pulled back a layer of his life he preferred to leave untouched, choices made from glass towers, consequences scattered like fallen leaves. Across people he never knew. As the cabin emptied, Sundar finally stood, taking his time. He grabbed his small backpack and slung it over one shoulder. There was no assistant waiting, no security detail, no luxury car outside. He wanted that way, to walk through the world without shields. But tonight, that vulnerability felt heavier. He moved through the terminal, slowly. The airport was alive with quiet movement, mothers guiding sleepy children. Tired businessmen staring blankly at their phones, janitors sweeping corners no one noticed. He passed them all, just another face in the crowd. A man on a personal mission. A son returning home. He was headed toward the connecting gate for his final flight when he saw her. She stood alone near gate 19, just past the small newsstand. She wasn't holding a sign, and she didn't look like someone waiting for anyone in particular. But when her eyes met Sundar's, it felt like she had been waiting for him all along. Her hair was dark and streaked with gray. Her face carried the quiet dignity of someone who had endured much and asked for little. Her clothes were simple cotton trousers, a faded shawl around her shoulders, but her posture was steady. She looked like someone who didn't need to speak loudly to be heard. Sundar slowed, unsure why. Something about her was familiar, and yet completely strange. She stepped toward him. Sundar Pichai. She said, not asking, but stating. He stopped. The sound of his name in her voice, it wasn't accusatory or adoring. It was calm, steady. Yes, he answered cautiously. Do we know each other? The woman gave a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. No, she said. But I know your mother. Those words froze him. His heart gave a sudden jolt. He hadn't told anyone about his mother's condition. He hadn't posted it, hadn't shared it with anyone outside his immediate family. Even his team at work believed. He was on a short sabbatical to reconnect with his roots. But this stranger, this woman with the quiet gaze, she knew something no one else could. Who are you? He asked, more firmly now. My name doesn't matter. she said. But what I have to tell you does. He glanced around. Travelers moved past them in quiet currents, oblivious. The loudspeaker above buzzed with a boarding announcement for another flight. And yet, the world seemed to narrow around them, shrinking to this moment, this woman. And her words, your mother, she continued, was not brought to the hospital for the reasons you think. His chest tightened. What do you mean? The woman took a breath, as if weighing every word. Your mother was trying to protect you. There's something she never told you. Something from your childhood. Something she believed would ruin your life if it ever came out. Sundar shook his head slowly, unsure whether to laugh or walk away. He had come to say goodbye, not unravel his past. Look, he said, trying to remain calm. I don't know who you are, or why you're telling me this. But if this is some kind of... It's not a scam, she interrupted gently. You think this is random? That I just found you at gate 19? No. She sent me. Sundar's breath caught. My mother sent you? Yes. 3 days ago, before she went into surgery. She was afraid she wouldn't wake up. So she told me everything, and she told me to find you. To give you something. The woman reached into her shawl and pulled out a small envelope. It was old, yellowed at the edges, the paper soft with time. It had been folded and unfolded many times. On the front was a single word, written in delicate handwriting. Sundar took it slowly. His fingers trembled slightly as they touched the fragile paper. He didn't open it yet. Couldn't. Why now? He asked. Why wait all these years? The woman gave him a look that carried decades of sorrow. Because she didn't think you were ready. And because she thought maybe she wasn't strong enough to face what you might do once you knew the truth. The envelope in his hand felt heavier than it should. What truth? Open it, she said. But not here, when you're alone. Before he could ask another question, she turned and began to walk away. No goodbye, no warning. Just a final glance over her shoulder that seemed to say, what you find next will change everything. Sundar stood frozen, staring at the envelope. He wanted to rip it open. He wanted to throw it away. He wanted to call his mother, hear her voice, demand to know what secrets she had hidden from him. But he did none of those things. Instead, he sat down in a quiet corner of the terminal, the envelope pressed between his hands like a sacred object. The noise of the airport faded into a distant hum, and all he could hear was the sound of his own breath and the whisper of a woman's voice repeating in his mind, she sent me. After what felt like hours. He tucked the envelope into his bag. He wasn't ready yet, not here. Not in a place filled with strangers and announcements and lights that never turned off. His flight was boarding. And at the end of that flight was a hospital room. And in that room was the one person who might still hold the answers. If she was still awake, and she was still alive. He stood up and walked slowly toward the gate, each step heavier than the last. Something inside him had shifted again. The version of himself he had known, the son, leader, the man shaped by hard work and quiet pride, had begun to fracture. Piece by piece, and in its place, something else was rising. Something that might be truer, or much darker. Asterisk, the forgotten street. Drive from the airport to the hospital was long. But Sundar barely noticed the city passing by outside the cab window. Streetlights blurred into golden streaks across the glass, like time itself slipping through his fingers. The envelope was still in his bag, untouched, yet it felt like it was burning a hole through the fabric. He could feel its weight against his leg, like a silent drumbeat reminding him that everything he thought he knew was about to break open. He had rehearsed this arrival in his mind for days. He had imagined himself walking into her hospital room, taking her hand and telling her she wasn't alone. He had played the scene over and over, the words he would say, the tears he might shed. But none of those scenes included a stranger at gate 19, or an envelope that whispered of hidden truths. The cab stopped in front of the hospital just past midnight. The parking lot was nearly empty. The building loomed tall and quiet under the yellow glow of the lamps. Sundar stepped out and paid the driver, then stood still for a moment, gathering the courage to face whatever waited inside Dot as he walked through the glass doors. The air changed, colder, clinical, filled with the faint smell of antiseptic and overripe flowers. The kind of air that made people whisper and walk slower. It wasn't the first hospital he had walked into, but tonight it felt different. Tonight, it felt like a crossroads. He moved through the lobby, past a sleeping security guard and a flickering TV. When he reached the nurse's station on the third floor, he offered his name and his mother's. The nurse on duty, young, tired, hair pulled back too tightly, typed on her keyboard. Then frowned. She was discharged, the nurse said, eyes still on the screen. Sundar stared at her. What? Your mother, she's no longer here. He leaned forward, trying to keep his voice steady. That's not possible. I flew halfway across the country. She was scheduled for surgery this morning. The nurse blinked and looked at him again, this time more carefully. Something flickered in her eyes, recognition, maybe, or concern. I'm sorry, she said quietly. But it says here she signed herself out. Earlier this evening. Signed herself out? Sundar repeated, the words sharp. She's 73. She can barely walk. Why would she do that? The nurse didn't answer right away. Instead, she stood, glanced around the empty station, and stepped closer. Look, she said in a low voice. I wasn't supposed to say anything, but she left something for you. She said if you came too late, I should give you this. From beneath the counter, the nurse pulled out a small paper bag. It looked like something from a local grocer plane, unmarked. She handed it to him slowly. Inside the bag was a single item. Asterisk, a brass key. Dot. It was old. The kind that didn't belong to a car or an apartment, but something older, perhaps a trunk or a gate. It was attached to a small scrap of folded paper. Sundar opened it, his breath catching in his throat. There were just 4 words written in trembling handwriting. Asterisk. Go to Gulmohar Street. His knees almost buckled. The name hit him like a wave crashing through years of silence. Street. He hadn't thought about that place in decades. It was the neighborhood he'd grown up in. Not the clean, modern one. From his later childhood, but the one before, the first slum he had ever known. A winding maze of tin roofs, cracked pavement, the scent of fried snacks and diesel. A place of heat and noise and sometimes hunger. A place he had buried deep in memory because it hurt too much to remember. Are you sure she left this? Sundar asked. The nurse nodded. Her voice was barely above a whisper now. She looked scared when she gave it to me. And she said something I didn't understand. What did she say? The nurse hesitated, then repeated it, word for word. She said, tell him the truth is older than me, older than him. And it lives behind the red door. Sundar's stomach turned. Behind. The red door. He remembered that too. A place at the very end of Gulmohar Street. A narrow alley barely wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side. And at the end of it, a small house with a red wooden door, chipped and faded. A house no one talked about. A place that seemed to exist outside of time. He thought it had been abandoned. He thought it had always been empty. But now it seemed it had been waiting. He left the hospital without another word. The streets were darker now, the silence deeper. Gulmohar Street wasn't far, only 20 minutes by car. But Sundar didn't take a car. Not this time. He walked. With every step. The air seemed to grow heavier. The street signs changed. The sidewalks thinned. The clean lines of the city blurred into older textures, walls with peeling paint, windows with rusted grates, broken lights flickering overhead. By the time he reached the edge of Gulmohar Street, the sky had started to pale. Dawn was approaching. Dogs slept under scooters. A single tea seller was setting up his stand, lighting a small stove. The street was just as he remembered it. Narrow, alive with the echoes of past voices. Sundar walked slowly, his breath catching as the memories returned. Here was the wall. He had scraped his knee on as a child. There was the corner where he used to sit with his mother, watching the world go by. And there, at the very end, stood the red door. Time had not been kind to it. The paint was flaking, the wood cracked, but the color was still there. Faded, but defiant. He reached into his bag and pulled out the brass key. His fingers trembled. As he slid it into the lock, it turned with a soft, dry click. The door creaked open, and inside the air was thick with dust. Silence. And something else, something sacred, something secret. He stepped inside and his world began to change. Asterisk the man. In the photograph, house behind the red door breathed with silence. Not the gentle kind, but a dense, watchful stillness, like the air had been waiting for someone to return. The smell of dust and old wood filled Sundar's lungs as he stepped inside. It was a place forgotten by time, furniture covered in pale cloths, walls yellowed from years of waiting. A cracked lantern hanging by a bent nail near the entrance. His footsteps echoed on the concrete floor, soft but definite. Outside, the street remained quiet, touched by the pale blush of morning. But inside, something pulsed beneath the silence. Tension in the air, as if the room itself remembered more than it should. Sundar paused in the doorway, eyes scanning the small space. There was a low table in the corner, a single chair beside it, and a rusted metal cupboard whose door hung ajar. Faint beams of light slipped through a gap in the curtains, landing on the floor like ghostly footprints. Then he saw it on the table. Half covered by an old shawl was a photo frame. The frame was old, wood chipped at the edges, the glass fogged slightly with time. He reached for it slowly, hands hesitant, as if afraid of what he might see. The photo inside showed two people. Standing side by side. One was his mother, young, smiling, eyes full of life. Her hair was tied back in a way he remembered from childhood, and she wore the same patterned sari she used to wear on festivals. Beside her stood a man Sundar had never seen before. He was tall, with sharp features and a calm presence. His arm rested lightly behind her back. They weren't touching, but there was something unmistakable between them, comfort, trust, maybe even something deeper. It was not a casual photo. It was intimate in a way that needed no words. Sundar stared at the man, trying to place the face. His mind shuffled through every image, every memory, every story he had been told. But this man didn't exist in any of them, not once, not ever. He turned the frame over and found a small inscription scratched into the wood. Bombay, 1979. He did the math. He was born in 1972. This photo was taken 7 years after he was born. So why had his mother never mentioned this man? He turned away from the table, feeling a sudden chill, as if the house had drawn breath. He crossed the room to the metal cupboard and pulled the door open fully. The hinges groaned in protest. Inside were stacks of old papers, most yellowed and brittle. He pulled them out slowly, laying them on the table beside the photo. The top sheet was an official-looking document, folded many times over. He unfolded it and read the first line. Birth registration certificate, Sundarajan. Pichai, his full name. But the father's name listed was not the man he had called Appa. All his life, it was a different name. A name he had never heard before. Vishwanath Iyer, his breath caught in his throat. He sat down hard in the chair, unable to stand. He read the document again, hoping he was wrong. Hoping it was a clerical error, a coincidence, a forgery. But the details were all there. The name matched his, the birth date. The mother's name, Latha. Pichai, his mother's full maiden name. He reached for another paper, this one folded even more tightly. A letter, handwritten in careful cursive. He read the first line. My dearest Sundar, if you're reading this, it means you have found the truth. I could never bring myself to tell you. His vision blurred. The room swayed slightly, and he felt the letter tremble in his hands. He kept reading. I loved you from the moment I first felt you move inside me. But I did not raise you alone. Your Appa, the man you called father, chose to give you his name. And his life, even though you were not his by blood, he did it with kindness, with grace. Not out of obligation, but out of love. He raised you as his own because to him you were but your real father. He was not the man the world knew. He was brilliant, compassionate, and troubled. Vishwanath was a teacher at the college where I worked. He and I shared ideas, dreams, long conversations. I was young. I was afraid. And when I found out I was pregnant, he disappeared. Not out of cruelty, but out of fear. He was being watched. There were things he knew. Secrets he was not supposed to uncover. I never told you because I wanted you to grow up safe. And your Appa gave you that. He gave you structure, peace, and a name the world could respect. But I know you. I know you seek truth. And truth should never be buried. If you want to understand who Vishwanath was truly, you will need to go to the only place. He ever called home after leaving us. Inside bottom drawer of the cupboard is a notebook. It is his journal. Read it, my son. And when you're ready, come find me. Love always. Amasender sat still for a long time after reading the letter. The world had shifted beneath him. Everything he had believed about his family. His roots, his story fractured. He was not the son of the man who raised him. And yet he was, because love had never been defined by blood alone. But there was another layer now. Something deeper. This was not just about parentage. It was about history, about danger. His mother's words weren't vague. She had said Vishwanath knew things, that he was being watched, that he had vanished. The kind of words that weren't about abandonment, but about sacrifice. Sundar stood and walked to the bottom drawer. It was jammed, swollen from years of moisture, but he managed to pull it open. Inside was a single cloth-bound notebook. On the cover was a name written in faded ink. V. Iyer 1981. He opened it to the first page. And the first sentence chilled him to the bone. They said I should never write this down. But the truth must exist somewhere. Even if I don't asterisk the truth in silence. Air inside the house behind the red door had grown heavier. It pressed against Sundar's skin, not like heat or humidity, but like memory dense and inescapable. The cloth-bound notebook in his hands trembled slightly as he held it open. The pages brittle from time, but ink still sharp, still alive. A man's voice seemed to speak from those lines, quiet but urgent. They said I should never write this down. But the truth must exist somewhere, even if I don't. The words echoed inside Sundar's mind, chilling him their clarity. This wasn't a journal. It was a confession. Or a warning. Maybe both. He turned the page slowly, and with each sentence, the picture of Vishwanath Iyer, his biological father, came into focus. I was working at the research lab in Chennai. My specialty was communication systems, but my obsession became something else. I was trying to understand how early neural signals in infants could be influenced by external patterns like sound, frequency. In simple words, I believe the brain could be gently shaped, long before memory ever began. Asterisk, they noticed. First, they encouraged me. Then they sent strangers to the lab. We were told to sign papers, silence clauses. Not government, not private. Either. Something in between. Men with no names. And then the disappearances began. My colleagues, one by one. The ones who asked too many questions. Asterisk. Sundar's hands tightened around the book. The writing was frantic in places, calmer in others. Vishwanath had clearly written this over months, maybe years. Thoughts folded into thoughts, like the mind behind them was always looking over its shoulder. When I met Latha, I was already being watched. I didn't tell her. I didn't want her to be part of it. But when she told me about the baby, everything changed. Suddenly, it wasn't just theory anymore. It was flesh. It was future. I ran, not because I didn't love her. Not because I didn't love you, but because staying meant death. For all of us, the next few pages were filled with drawing diagrams of signal patterns, brain waves, handwritten calculations. Some of it was beyond Sundar's knowledge, even after decades in technology. These were not the musing of a madman. They were the work of someone ahead of his time. They weren't after me because I failed. They were after me because I succeeded. I built something small, quiet. A signal pattern that could train the infant mind to think faster, absorb more. I only tested it once. Just once. On a prototype chip. I never knew if it worked. Not for certain, but I sent it. I sent it to the only person I could trust, to the only person who had the chance to use it without being caught. Your mother. Sundar dropped the notebook for a moment, his heart pounding so hard it hurt. The realization cracked through him like thunder. The chip, his first memory with his mother, the old, dusty transistor radio she had kept on their kitchen shelf. How it always hummed late into the night. How she had never let him open it, even though he was always curious. He had thought it was just music. Just noise to lull him to sleep. But what if it wasn't? What if the sound wasn't music at all? What if it was programming, training? What if everything he had become, his accelerated learning, his way of seeing patterns others missed, his connection to technology, wasn't just talent or chance? What if it had been designed by the father he never knew? He turned the page. I know you'll read this one day, and if you do, forgive me. I was not brave, but I tried to be kind. I never stopped loving you, and your mother never stopped protecting you. If you still want answers, if you want proof, go back to the transistor. Take it apart. Inside it, there is a chip, etched with my initials .v.I. It was the first and last thing I ever created, and I created it for you. The final line was written in shakier handwriting. If you're reading this, then maybe you're still alive, and if you are, live without fear, my son. They'll stop watching you once they realize you've already outgrown. The cage dot, the last page was blank. Sundar sat in silence for a long time. The notebook rested in his lap. Outside, the sun had fully risen. Light streamed through the narrow window and struck the photo on the table, his mother, young and brave, beside a man who had disappeared for her safety. For his dot, he had come here to be a sun dot to comfort his mother, but now he was someone else entirely. He was the product of love, sacrifice, and a forgotten experiment. He stood slowly, took the notebook, the photo, the key. His legs felt heavy, but his mind was clear. He didn't know if what his father claimed was real or delusion, but he knew one thing for certain. He had to find that old transistor. He had to go home, not to the house he built in Palo Alto. To the skyscraper where he led a company that shaped the world, but to the small room in Chennai, where his mother had raised him quietly with a strength no one saw, where an old radio still sat on a dusty shelf and maybe inside it, the beginning of everything. He stepped out of the house behind the red door. The street was waking now. People were moving, voices rising, smells of breakfast beginning to fill the air. But Sundar walked alone down the path of his past, carrying something greater than memory. Truth. Not the polished kind on podiums or interviews. But the messy kind, full of pain, silence, and sacrifice. And in that truth, he found something he hadn't expected to feel. Piece. Because in the end, the woman who raised him had loved him enough to protect a secret, and the man he never met had loved him enough to become one, and somewhere between those two truths, Sundar Pichai finally saw himself. Asterisk.